So I would be remiss if I didn't address the ABA Model Rule 1.4 on communications, because effective communication is obviously the bedrock of our attorney-client relationships. And the model rule, which most of our state rules of professional conduct are guided after, speaks to a few issues as to the importance of communicating. It speaks obviously particularly with regard to our attorney-client relationships, but you'll see throughout this presentation that all of these tools are broadly applicable, regardless of whether it's just in the attorney-client relationship or in our working colleagues, with opposing counsel, with court personnel, etc. And so the focus here is keeping clients informed. That's first and foremost. Consulting with the clients about their objectives and the methods by which those might be achieved, promptly complying with reasonable requests for information, conveying the relevant limitations of your representation, what you are and are not willing to do, whether that's limiting the scope of your representation or the manner in which you're going to represent the client. And then explaining things so that the client can make informed decisions throughout the representation. And so if this is fundamental, why is it so hard, right? And why do many states, I'm most familiar with North Carolina, that's my jurisdiction. And in North Carolina, the state bar says one of the top grievances they get are a lack of responsiveness and a lack of communication by the lawyer. So why in the world is this so hard? So we'll start with our first polling question. If Mike wants to put that one up, and let's start getting a sense of why is this so hard? What are the biggest challenges that you face to effective communication? And we'll just see which of these three, there are others besides these three, but I'm gonna get a sense of the audience of which one, if any, might take the lead on the most challenging to have effective communications. So I'll give you a second to complete the poll that has popped up in your window. So take a minute to answer that question, and then we'll see the results in a sec. All right, so there's not enough time to prepare for or have those lengthy, difficult conversations was 56%. I feel like I'm talking, but no one is listening, 21%, and then dealing with difficult or unpredictable emotions is 30%. So pretty even on the last two, and it looks like not enough time to prepare or have the lengthy conversations is in the lead. We're gonna tackle tools for each of these today, but it's really helpful for me to see sort of which one is in the lead. All right, so as I mentioned, I like the fact that these tools are broadly applicable. So I am all about efficiency, and if I can learn something that's going to be broadly applicable and help with all of my communications, then I am all about it, and that's what I want to offer for y'all today. So whether we're dealing with our clients, whether we're dealing with our colleagues, whether we're dealing with opposing counsel or court personnel, all of these tools are going to help in each of those conversations, in each of those relationships. And the goal here is to increase our effectiveness of those conversations, create better outcomes, and then less conflict and less stress along the way. All right, so we're gonna go through 3 steps today, and then I have specific tools within each step. So step 1 is preparing for the conversation. Step 2 is listening actively, and step 3 is anticipating obstacles. In my coaching practice, I am amazed at how frequently lawyers seek advice from me about having difficult conversations. And I ask them, well, what have you done so far? Or what have you done to prepare? And they look at me like it had never occurred to them to prepare for a difficult conversation. And so I'll challenge you that you spend time preparing for client meetings. You spend time preparing to meet with opposing counsel. You spend time preparing for hearings, depositions, mediations. So in the same way that you would prepare for anything else, you also need to prepare for difficult conversations and prepare for how to make your conversations and your communications even more effective. The second is, I'm also continually amazed at how horrible lawyers are at listening. And I used to be horrible at listening as well. So I'm calling myself out as well. It is a learned skill. You have to practice and choose to be better at listening. And I'll give you some tools for how to do that. But I would suggest that listening makes up more than 50% of effective communication. So I'm going to challenge you to work on your active listening skills and think about how you can apply some of these tools today in your practice. And then we'll spend some time talking about handling objections and dealing with those difficult or unpredictable emotions, which can be scary. They can be overwhelming. It can kind of feel like deer in headlights. We're going to talk a little bit about neurobiology and how that's at play, which to me just sort of helps us have a better understanding of what's going on. And when we can understand things, I feel like they're less scary. When I can understand something, it's not as scary, uncertain, or overwhelming. And then in my mind also, I can have a little bit more grace and compassion for somebody if I can notice that they're at the effect of just the neurobiology at play. And often that helps remind me also that it's not about me, which is something that comes up when we are dealing with other people's difficult emotions. It brings stuff up in us that makes it even more difficult to deal with. All right. Excuse me. So the first step is preparing. So how are we going to set ourselves up for success? And we have a couple of tools to work through step one. So this is the preparing stage. This is long before you ever have the either face-to-face or verbal conversation with somebody else. So before you even start the communicating with somebody else, there is a lot of work to be done just within yourself to prepare for an effective communication that's going to increase the likelihood of a better outcome as a result of the communication. So a few of the tools we're going to talk about in terms of preparing yourself before you even initiate the communication. One, I like to call clear the runway. Two is working with neurobiology instead of against it. And three is going to be identifying a clear goal. So we'll dive deeper into each of those. So first is clearing the runway. I think sometimes we think we don't have enough time to clear the runway, but I would suggest to you that we have to make time to clear the runway. Otherwise, we're going to run into something along the runway before we even take off. And so we're certainly, if what we want is to have an effective communication and a really good outcome, then we need to take the time. And it doesn't even need to be much time, but we need to take a little bit of time to make sure that we're clearing things out in order to increase the effectiveness of our conversation and the likelihood of an effective result. So a couple things that we should do when we're trying to prepare to clear the runway is ask ourselves some questions. Is this the right time for this conversation or communication? And can I give this my focus without distraction? So thinking about the things that you can control, because we can't always control the other person. Is this a good time for me? Has my child kept me up in the middle of the night? And maybe if it's not super urgent, maybe today is not the right day to have this conversation because I haven't had enough sleep and I'm stressed out, right? Do I have a brief due? Do I have a impending deadline? Like, is this really the right time to have this conversation? Or would there be a different time that would be a better time to have the conversation where I am in a better headspace? And then also controlling your physical environment. We are constantly distracted by cell phones, landlines, the pinging of our email. If you've been to the wellness webinar, I sometimes talk about ways to turn those notifications off or to minimize those. I strongly encourage you to do that, but that's a different topic for a different day. To the extent that you can control those physical distractions, I would encourage you to do so because it sets your conversation up for better success. I had a former colleague who, when I went into his office to talk with him about something important, whether it was case related or staff related or otherwise, I didn't feel like I was getting his full attention because his desk phone would ring he would look at his email, he would look at his cell phone. So I tried to control that as much as possible. I would invite him into my office to have the conversation instead of me going to him. And then I even started reserving a conference room so that my email and my phone weren't ringing, his email and his phone on his desktop weren't distracting him. So then the only thing I had to deal with was his cell phone, which I couldn't really control that he still looked at that during the meeting. But just think about ways that you can try to control and mitigate the distractions that pop up. And you could also even state it at the beginning that, you know, this meeting's really important and it's only going you anticipate only needing 20 minutes and you're going to silence your cell phone because it's really important, and you would ask that they do the same. And of course they don't, you know, necessarily have to, but that's a way of saying that I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not doing, but I'm also telling you how important this is. And the goal is to have a really productive conversation. So that's why you're asking for the distraction-free area. And then in terms of sort of managing your own headspace, this is a little bit individualistic, right? So whatever you need to do to make sure that you sort of have space in your head to have this conversation. For me, it's a mindfulness practice. It's a meditation practice. It can be for other people walking. I know a lot of cyclists who love to cycle really early in the morning, or runners who like to run, and that helps them sort of clear their headspace, work through things in their head, and then be in a place to be able to have a productive conversation. But just sort of checking in with yourself and noticing, how can I set myself up for the most success, both in the physical space and my headspace, as well as the timing of the conversation. So controlling the things you can control is a great way to have an effective conversation, or to set the stage for an effective conversation. We can't control everything. We can't control how things land for the other person. We can't control ultimately what they're going to do, but there are certain things that we can influence and control. And our headspace, the timing of it, and our physical space are some of those things that we can control. All right, so the next tool within our step 2, which is our prepare, is working with neurobiology. And so the first piece of it is just understanding that it is always at play, right? So it's like a current, whether you're swimming in it or rowing some sort of boat in it, it is always there. And so it's going to be easier to be aware of it and go with the current than to try to swim into the current. And so with neurobiology, just understanding that it is constantly going on in our bodies are wired that way. That is how we have survived, and it's how we will continue to survive, can be really helpful just to be aware of it, right? And then understand, then start noticing when it's happening. And so this is a dual application. It's noticing it in yourself, but then it's also noticing it in the other person that you're communicating with. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is when our amygdala hijacks our prefrontal cortex. So the oldest part of our brain, the reptilian brain, sits at the base of our skull. And that's the part of our brain that has kept us alive and has noticed when we perceive a threat, it triggers a response and it increases the cortisol levels. It takes over, think of it, moves from the passenger seat into the driver's seat. It grabs the wheel and it takes over from your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that is responsible for higher level thinking, for problem solving, for emotional regulation, and for memory. So all of that goes offline when you feel threatened, and the part of your brain that's going to help you stay alive takes over. Okay. So it's really important to just notice and know that that happens. So in the long time ago, the threats may have been a saber-toothed tiger. Now, our bodies may perceive a snarky tone on a phone call or an email in the same way that we used to perceive a saber-toothed tiger. And so we can still have that experience of the amygdala hijack with a snarky tone in an email or a phone call. And then the part of the brain that we need, and that we need the other person to be online to have this productive conversation, goes offline. Okay. And so when that happens, when our emotions are high, our logic is low. So whether it's me or whether it's the other person, if the amygdala has hijacked and is in the driver's seat, the logic is probably going to be low or non existent. So just recognizing when that's happening and then figuring out what your plan is to perhaps retreat and readdress another day. And we'll talk a little bit about some tools later on in the presentation about what do we do when those difficult emotions come up and when the amygdala is hijacked. So how do we know when this is going on in ourselves or in others? For me, it was easier to start noticing it in myself than in others, but sometimes people can notice it in others easier than themselves. The point is just start noticing it. When the amygdala hijacks the prefrontal cortex, the heart tends to have an increased heart rate. Sometimes you might feel hot or sweaty. Your face might flush. You might experience that dry mouth. Like if you ever get nervous before, for instance, like an oral argument and your mouth starts getting really dry, that is just your neurobiological response to the perceived threat. Perhaps it's the threat that the judge is going to rule against you. Perhaps it's the threat that you're going to look funny in front of your colleagues, right? That is your body perceiving a threat and then physiologically responding. You might have an upset stomach, lose your appetite. Noticing if someone suddenly gets fidgety or suddenly has a loud or angry outburst when they didn't before, that might be a sign that their amygdala is now in the driver's seat. If they suddenly can't focus or they suddenly can't remember, or if there's like a 90-degree turn that sort of comes out of nowhere, all of those might be signs either for yourself or for the person that you're interacting with that their amygdala has been hijacked. And so just start looking for these signs and noticing them. There also can be signs of withdrawal. So they might sort of shut down. Their body language might change. They may sort of contract and withdraw. Those are all signs of amygdala hijack. It's sometimes also referred to as fight or flight. So the fighting sometimes is easy to see. The flight or the freezing part is sometimes not as obvious because it's quieter and softer. But if somebody is suddenly withdrawing or shutting down, that may also be a sign of neurobiology at play. And so this comes into play a lot in our communications, and then it also can create some conflict. And so just notice that the threat, the stimuli comes in, it gets perceived as a threat. And then we have some sort of defend behavior, whether that's fight or flight. And so I might receive an email, I perceive a tone to it. And so then I pick up the phone and I say, why are you being so unreasonable? Well, now my tone is now the stimuli that somebody else on the other end perceives as a threat, and then they get in defend behavior. And so we're in this loop, which creates our unproductive conversations. And sometimes it can rise to the level of conflict, right? But other times it's just a completely unproductive conversation. So being aware of it, and then we'll talk about how do we disrupt the loop? Well, we focus on elongating the time between the stimuli and the response. Okay, so the antidote for how to interrupt this conflict loop that is very natural and very neurobiologically normal is to elongate the gap between the stimuli and the response so that you get to choose it instead of just having that knee-jerk reaction. It's easier said than done. It takes practice. You will probably try it and then fail at it, and that's okay. Keep trying and keep practicing. So one way to do it is taking a mindful pause and breathing. I don't care how you do it. Sometimes I like to ask myself a question. So I like to give my brain another job to do, especially when I'm in judgment and evaluation. I will give my brain another job to be curious and to ask a question to help choose my response instead of just having the knee-jerk reaction that then keeps us in that loop, in that unproductive loop. Remember, when emotions are high, logic is low. So I would recommend not trying to reason through it with the other person because it's going to be unproductive and it could further exacerbate the conflict loop. I know a lot of you said that time is your challenge. Unfortunately, the science that they've studied brains under MRI is saying that when we are in amygdala hijack, it takes at least 20 minutes for the part of our brain that we need to come back online. So for that prefrontal cortex to come back to the driver's seat, which again is the part that's responsible for the logic, the creative thinking, the problem solving, the memory, the part that we really need to be engaged in these conversations takes 20 minutes to come back online. And so that's a bummer because we don't have 20 minutes to wait. But if that is the situation and we're feeling frustrated and we're feeling like we're not having a productive conversation, it really may be the best strategy to pause and come back another time and schedule a different time to have the conversation and regroup, because you may just have diminishing returns and then you're completely wasting your time for the next 20 minutes as opposed to pausing and coming back. All right. The third tool within the prepare process is to identify a clear goal. And again, most of my coaching clients skip this. In fact, a lot of times when I mediate, the parties don't have really any idea what they actually want when I ask them what they really hope to get out of a resolution. But it's really important, right? Can you imagine getting on a plane and you don't have a flight plan? You don't know where you're going. No, you always have a clear goal when you're on a plane or a train. You need to know your destination in order to help figure out how to get there. And so it's really important to ask yourself, what do I hope is going to happen as a result of this conversation? What is the specific desired outcome? If I got to the end of this conversation, how would I know it was successful? And take some time to think through that. Is there something that you specifically want the other person to start doing differently? Is there something specifically you want the other person to stop doing? Is there something in particular that you love that they do and you'd like to affirm them and encourage them to keep doing that? Right? So it's really important that you spend just a couple minutes. It does not have to be long. It can be less than 0.1 of your day to ask yourself at the end of the conversation, what does success look like? What do I hope to accomplish? What is the specific desired outcome? Do I just want to make sure that I am communicating my experience of something? Do I want to try to influence their behavior to be different? Do I want them to start doing, stop doing, or continue doing something? Do I want them to help solve a problem with me? Do I want joint problem solving? Right? What is my goal so that I can lay that out for myself, consider laying that out for them at the beginning of the conversation for clarity and to see if maybe they can help you accomplish the goal. And then also to help figure out what are the strategies that I need to use, what are the tools I need to use to help me accomplish my goal. Okay. So I had a coaching client who made a mistake, and she was torn up about it. She had already the managing partner knew about it, client knew about it, but in sort of the trauma and the dealing with the how to disclose it to the client and fix it, they hadn't really dealt with, okay, now as a practice, sort of where do we go from here? And so she was avoiding the conversation with the managing partner, even though she knew she needed to have this conversation with the managing partner. And so I just asked her these simple questions of, okay, let's say you get to the end of the conversation with your managing partner. What do you hope will have happened? If you had a magic wand, what would you achieve by having this conversation with the managing partner? And she identified that she wanted to make sure that the managing partner knew how deeply this is impacting her and her work, how sorry she was, but also how deeply this was impacting her. And then 2, she wanted to hear from the managing partner, where did she stand in terms of her long-term with the firm and, how they were going to support her going forward, how they were going to make sure this mistake didn't happen again. And so once she had clarity that those were her 2 main objectives, then we could sort of map out a plan of how she was going to get to those objectives. And then the conversation went much better than she ever anticipated it would, because she was stuck in the fear, doubt, worry, and had not identified what her clear goals were. And then when she went into the conversation, she even chose to articulate those goals to the managing partner so that they could get on the same page about the purpose of the meeting, and also stay on track with it, right? Especially when the big emotions came up and could potentially derail them from it. Additionally, when you sort of identify your goals and then you lead with those goals in the conversation, it helps make sure that the other person is not misinterpreting what your intent is in having the conversation, or whether they're misinterpreting or whether they don't know, right? Human nature, if we don't know something, is often to fill it in with nefarious intent. And so if you can sort of control and set the tone and also set the direction of the meeting, that can help aid in having a really productive conversation. All right, so before we shift to step 2, which is listening actively, we're going to do another poll to see how often you use open-ended questions. All right. 68% of you frequently use open-ended questions. This is good. I'm glad to hear this. 27% of you rarely use open-ended questions, and 6% would like to know what an open-ended question is. I'll get you covered in a second. You'll know what an open-ended question is. And then my rarely people, hopefully in a minute, I will show you all the benefits of using open-ended questions, and possibly convert you. And I saw that someone couldn't see the slide, so I am trying to switch my displays and see if this is any better. All right, so hopefully the person who could not see the slides before can now see the slides. So we've prepared for our communication, and now we're actually going to be with another person, and we need to listen actively. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? So that should tell us something about the importance of listening as opposed to speaking. And I said earlier, and I will reiterate, that I think listening is more than 50% of effective communication. All right, and this is a quote that I love. To have a dialogue means to believe that the other has something worthwhile to say, and to entertain his or her point of view and perspective. Engaging in a dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions, but the pretense that they alone are valid and absolute. All right, so active listening has 3 different parts to it. I like to lay out 3 different tools to it. So 1 is open-ended questions. 2 is listening with purpose, which means listening to understand, not to respond, which is hard for us, which is hard for everybody. And then 3 is reflecting back. So we'll dive deeper into each of these tools. All right. So what is an open-ended question, and what's so great about them anyway? This little owl was cute, so he needed to be in the presentation. All right, so open-ended questions start with how or what. They lead to a fill-in-the-blank response. So they're not closed-ended in the sense that they lead to just a yes or a no or cut off the answer. They arise from curiosity and they expand the conversation. So if you think of a fill in the blank or a big box for you to write your response, that's an open-ended question. It's not a leading question. It does not suggest an answer. It's not a cross-examination question. It's not an interrogation, right? So if you think of, it's the opposite of cross-examination questions. It's really trying to gather information. It's trying to acquire information and learn something new. Okay, so it's how or what. It's not do or did, or can, right? It doesn't, if you are getting a lot of yes or no responses, then you're probably asking closed-ended questions. And you may need to just consider changing the linguistics to starting with a how or a what, right? So what did you eat for breakfast is an open-ended question. A closed-ended a closed-ended question would be, did you have cereal for breakfast, right? So you see the difference. What's so great about open-ended questions? When done well, they demonstrate genuine interest and they really do help you gather new information. They can also help you dodge defensiveness because generally people don't like being interrogated or cross-examined. And so if you can ask them questions in a way that are not interrogatory or cross-examining, then you're probably going to dodge some defensiveness and start laying the foundation for a more productive conversation. And they tend to empower problem solving. And then they can also buy you time if needed. So when you are asking open-ended questions, the other person is speaking. And so that takes you off the hook, that you don't have to respond or speak while they're speaking if you need to buy time, whether that's because you're feeling some of the amygdala hijack things, or whether you just need more time to think about something or process something, whatever the case may be, it can help give you some time. All right, so how do we ask better questions? So think of starting your question with how or what, phrasing the question to begin with a how or a what. That will help. One of my favorite open-ended questions is, could you tell me more about that? It's really simple. It doesn't require a lot of brain power. It's just, could you tell me more about that? You know, you mentioned that it's difficult to get all your filing done. Can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me what the impediments are? Ask one question at a time. So no compound questions, no stacking your questions. One, that starts to feel like a cross-examination, deposition, interrogation. But two, you also then don't necessarily know what question they're answering, and they may sidestep one of your questions, and then you may forget, and they may not answer the question that you need them to answer. And then really allow time for the answer. We often will ask a question and then we'll cut them off before they even answer the question. I train lawyers to be mediators, and this is one of the things that we work on the most. This is one of the most difficult things for lawyers to do, is to ask open-ended questions one at a time and then allow time for the answer. But it's so important because really it's a gift. Our listening of somebody else is a gift. It creates common ground and a common understanding. It can really convey genuine interest and concern and help you create the foundation to have a more productive conversation. One author said that our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts within another person, which I think is beautiful. So just think of it as a gift. Our listening is a gift. And then selfishly, our listening also helps increase the chances that we are going to meet our goal or our objective of having that conversation, increases the effectiveness of the conversation, and makes it more likely that we're going to accomplish the outcome that we would like from the conversation. All right. So listening to understand, listening with purpose, is listening to understand instead of just respond. So anytime that you're finding yourself trying to think of the counter arguments to something, trying to point out where they're wrong about something, this is listening to respond as opposed to listening to understand. I'm not saying that you should never do that. I'm just saying that if that's where you go first, you're missing an opportunity to understand and connect with the other person. And when you understand and connect with the other person, it makes it more likely that they will then reciprocate to you. So human beings are very reciprocal in nature. It's from our mirror neurons that exist in our brain. We like to copy each other and be similar to each other. And so if you lead with understanding and open-ended questions, notice how it changes the other person's behavior towards you. They will instinctively try to mirror you or reflect back what you are doing. And so when I notice that I am being judgy or evaluative, what I mean by that, thinking right, wrong, good, bad, should, shouldn't, everything that our legal training teaches us to do, which is really important. There's a time and a place for it. But I need to pause it for now to make sure I'm understanding the other person. There will be plenty of time for me to lay out my position about why they're wrong or why they should or shouldn't do something. But first, I need to really understand them. And one of the things that I do is give my brain a job, and I will ask it questions. I will ask and get curious about what are they feeling? What might they be needing? What's important to them? What do they value? I'm reading the Q&A. Hang on. Oh, okay. I'll get to the Q&A question in a minute. It's a good one. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. I was in mediation that was running late into the evening. So it was like 8 p.m. We had been at it all day, and siblings fighting in an estate dispute. And I conveyed one of the offers. Who knows? It was like the 10th or 12th offer of the day. And out of the blue, one of the parties said to me, among other things, I feel like you're on her side, right? And so this was a big sort of emotional outburst. It was a 90-degree turn. It was not something that I had ever heard her say all day. It was very surprising. So that told me that there were some big emotions at play, and perhaps she was experiencing neurobiology at play. Maybe her amygdala was hijacking her prefrontal cortex. And so I paused. I am human. I felt triggered because it's very important to my integrity to maintain neutrality as a mediator. And I certainly thought through in my head, well, what could I have done perhaps that would have caused her to think that? So I paused and dealt with all of that. And then I got curious about what she might be feeling and needing. It was 8 p.m. Nobody had had dinner yet. She was tired. She was hungry. She was needing finality, right? The day had drug on for a long time. Any estate dispute, there's always grief at play. And so sometimes just the finality of the resolution helps with the grieving process. What was important to her was her father's legacy, right? So these were the questions that I was asking myself to connect with her and to understand her without just sort of responding and telling her, no, I'm not on the other person's side, right? So that's sort of an example of how we can pause or suspend our own judgment by giving our brain a job to do and really trying to understand the other person. One of the questions in the Q&A is, as lawyers, we've been trained to ask questions that we already know the answer to. How do we untrain the thought process? It takes a long time. It takes constant reminders. But I will say that holding space for the possibility that you're not the smartest person in the room and that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room is important, right? Because whether it is opposing counsel or our clients or our colleagues, other people have great ideas too, right? And so if we can ask curious, open-ended questions, we learn a lot of information. And some of the most creative solutions that parties have ever come up with were things that just never crossed my mind. It just was never on my radar. But by asking them and inviting them into the problem solving with me, they came up with creative solutions that would have never occurred to me, right? So things like when a divorcing couple is fighting over the last bank account, what are you going to do about it? Well, They decided they were going to put it into the child's 529 plan. It had never occurred to me as an option, not something that a judge could have, has the statutory authority, at least in North Carolina, to order. But with their private settlement, they could do what they wanted, right? Um, Similarly, with estate cases, uh, creating holding assets in an annuity to create a revenue stream, but make sure that the person doesn't spend all the money at once, right? These are some creative solutions that if I never asked the open-ended question and encourage them to the joint problem solving, would have never come up. So it takes time. It takes a willingness to be curious. It takes a willingness to be, I was going to say it takes a willingness to be wrong. I'm not sure that you're actually wrong though, but it takes a willingness to not have to be at the front of the race and right first and all the time, if that makes sense, right? There's plenty of time for you to have your airtime, but if you invite others to share first, so I guess maybe one tool is to just consider going second or third, right? And invite asking open-ended questions to help you invite others to speak first or second. And then practice, practice, practice. For those of you who have access to young-ish children, they're great to practice on because they have zero judgment and they'll chat your ears off. So practice asking them open-ended questions. Practice getting curious about what they're feeling and what they're needing and what's important to them. And then the third tool in our second step of active listening is reflecting back. This is something that I have found that lawyers are horrible at, but it's super, super important. And so once you have sort of thought about what is the other person saying, feeling, and needing, restating it back to them in their own words is so important. I hear you saying that you were shocked when your brother filed a notice of claim in the estate, right? Is very different than I hear you, I get it, I understand, right? If I say, I hear you, I get it, I understand, any of those, what do I understand? What do I get? What do I hear? Prove it. Prove that I hear them and understand them by reflecting their words back to them, okay? Especially if they keep repeating the same thing, they need to know that you hear it by you saying it back to them. Have you ever had the client, like I have had, who just keeps repeating themselves over and over and over again? Try this. Try finding the phrase that they keep saying and repeat it back to them. I hear that is very important to you, XYZ, or I hear that ABC is a huge problem for you. State their words back to them so that they know that you actually hear them. It's different than I get it, I hear you. Okay? Go further and imagine what they must be feeling. Okay? I hear you saying that you were shocked when your brother filed the notice of claim because you have bent over backwards to help him out throughout your life. I imagine you felt betrayed, right? You can take a guess. It's called empathetic guessing at what they're feeling. And I often phrase it as I imagine because I don't know. And that's my way of respectfully guessing what they must be feeling. And they will let you know if you're on point or not. They might say, yeah, that's exactly right. Or they might say, well, I wasn't really feeling betrayed. I was shocked or frustrated or hurt, right? Well, now they've just given you that feeling. And now you can say, yeah, that was it. That sounds like you were really feeling hurt by that, right? So the prompts are, I hear you saying blank, insert their own words, and then reflect back their emotions. I imagine you're feeling blank. And then sometimes you can also say, because you have a need for blank. I often leave that need piece out because it sometimes gets confusing for people because most of us aren't in touch with our needs. And usually it's enough to acknowledge what it is that they're saying, what's important, and then how they're feeling about it. All right. So we'll do our next poll as we are shifting to get ready for step 3, which is anticipating obstacles. So which of these are ineffective ways to deal with someone else's emotional reaction? Which ones are ineffective? This is a softball for y'all. All right. A couple of you fell for it and only picked one or the other, but most of you got it right that both of them are ineffective, right? And we'll talk about in a minute why arguing with them about what they're feeling or telling them what they should feel or think instead are both completely ineffective and not going to get you where you want to be. All right. So what do we do when we have objections come up, right? So first, it's really helpful if you shift your view about an objection, right? So I used to think of objections, I used to think of sort of sparring or fighting or volleying, right? And I would think an objection is they're throwing up a wall that I've got to figure out how to block down, and I would get defensive about it, um, which is fine. You can think of it that way. But it helped me sort of shift my perspective when I realized that objections are just one, they can be signposts. They can be like a waving flag to point to there's something important here on the other side. There's something that feels important to them that maybe is threatened or that they're concerned about. And so if I can get curious and dig beneath the surface to find what that is, then maybe I can help understand their position better and come up with a solution for their concern. Another thing is that objections might just be strategies to help them protect something or to help them get a need met. And so instead of me thinking that objections were these horrible, awful things that I had to combat and I had to bomb it and get through it, I could instead think about it being just a strategy that they're choosing to either protect something that's really important to them that they care about, or a strategy to get a need met, which is also important to them. And that can be important for me because for me to learn and uncover that can really help me gather information and try to create that win-win solution, right? To try to figure out what they need and what I need and how we're going to work together to find that solution. So again, I like to ask myself questions. And so when an objection comes up, I like to think, well, how might their point of view be valid on that? How might that objection be valid? Why shouldn't they agree with me? Why shouldn't they do what I'm saying? So that I can try to then address those concerns. Yeah, Q&A. When a client is angry about something, I find they rarely listen to reason. They don't want to be told. They don't have a good case, and they're not sympathetic to any problems the lawyer may be having. Their attitude surprises me. Yeah, we'll talk about anger. We'll talk about big emotions in a minute. I know we got 5 minutes left. So a couple things are going on there. One, of course, they're not going to listen to reason. When their emotions are high and their amygdala has hijacked their prefrontal cortex, they can't. They're physically, it's impossible to do it. And then two, a big emotion like that, anger, is actually a expression of an unmet need, right? So I'm not saying it's easy, but you could, one, give them some time because their prefrontal cortex needs to come back online. Sometimes we can't do that because we don't have time, or because they keep getting triggered and their prefrontal cortex is never going to come back online during the time that we have to interact with them. So sometimes we just have to deal with it. But two is, if you reflect back to them what you're hearing them say and you label their feeling, right? It sounds like you're really frustrated. It sounds like you're angry about this, right? That will at least help them know that you hear them, right? And then clear is kind. So being clear and succinct that here are the challenges with your case, here are your options, is sometimes the best you can do. All right. So again, don't argue with their feelings. Don't minimize their experience, right? If they have an injured foot, you don't say, well, at least you didn't lose your life, right? That's not going to be helpful. And don't tell them what they should be thinking or feeling instead, because you're just going to get into an argument and a debate. I mean, when have you ever been on the receiving end of that and said, oh yeah, you're right? No, it doesn't happen. So instead, acknowledge them. It can be really powerful to just thank somebody for sharing that with you. I mean, just if you've never tried it, try it. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. That must be really hard. And then just stop talking and see what happens. It's amazing. Sometimes you'll just see their shoulders relax because they've been heard for the first time. And then you can also reflect back. It sounds like you're concerned about X. Did I get that right? And then are you willing to discuss it further? All right, diffusing defensiveness. Remember, this is neurobiology at play. So what is triggering them? What is the thing that's important to them that's feeling threatened right now? Acknowledge them. Focus on what might be important to them. And then pause and allow time for their brain to come back online. If you can, sometimes you can't. Just know that it is a protective strategy. But sometimes just acknowledging something can be really powerful. And remember, acknowledgement does not equal agreement. Okay. I had this come up in a training one time where a lawyer told me that when I was showing them what it was like to be a mediator, and I said to one of the parties, I hear that it's really important to you that you maintain your business reputation. The lawyer's comment was, well, were you losing your neutrality there? So I think what he thought was that acknowledgement meant agreement, and it does not. You can acknowledge somebody without ever agreeing with anything they're saying. You're just reflecting back what they're saying and making sure that they know that you have heard them. All right, and then dealing with big emotions. Bill Eddy has this great approach. It's called EAR, right? So again, I've been focusing on listening is more than 50% of your communication. His acronym is EAR, which is empathy, attention, and respect. And so anytime you have somebody showing you a big emotion, you can try one or all of these. So empathy is simply some of the tools we've been talking about, reflecting back. That seems really hard. I hear your frustration. I can see how worried you are about this. Attention. I want to understand more. Tell me more. I will pay full attention to your concerns. I'm interested in knowing your point of view. Respect. I respect your efforts at dealing with this problem. Or that was, a helpful presentation you gave, right? So empathy, attention, and respect, one or all of them can help deal with these difficult emotions. All right, we're running up on time. So here is a review of the communication tools that we covered today. My contact information is at the back of the slide. I'm happy to be a resource. If you want to reach out, remember to join us for part 2 of our series on August 28th at 12 noon Central Time. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thanks.